I'm Emily Cruz. I'm the Assistant Director of the Marty Center, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's lecture by Dr. Shannen Dee Williams. Before I introduce Dr. Williams, I would like to give you a bit of information about the Marty Center and about the Lumen Christi Institute, your host for the evening. The Marty Center is part of the University of Chicago Divinity School, housed here in Swift Hall. We build on the Div School's long-standing conviction that the best and most innovative scholarship in religion arises from sustained dialogue with the world beyond the academy. We contribute to this dialogue by offering scholarly perspectives on the religious questions facing the wider public, while providing the faculty and students of the Div School the tools and opportunities to situate their scholarly questions within a broader cultural frame of reference. If you visit our website at martycenter.org, you can learn more about our events and programs and sign up for our very lovely monthly newsletter. The mission of the Lumen Christi Institute is to make the Catholic intellectual tradition in its depth and breadth a vital part of the culture of today's university through non-credit courses, master classes, and lectures like this one. I also want to thank our co-sponsors who helped to ensure the success of this evening's program. Those are the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality, the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture, and the History Department at the University of Chicago, the Catholic Theological Union, St. Thomas the Apostle Catholic Church here in Chicago, America Media, and the Thea Bowman Foundation. And now, what you've all been waiting for, the introduction and then lecture of Dr. Williams. Dr. Shannen Dee Williams is Associate Professor of History at the University of Dayton. A historian of African American experience with research and teaching specializations in women's, religious, and Black freedom movement history, Williams is the author of Subversive Habits. You can find a copy over there. Subversive Habits, Black Catholic Nuns in the Long African American Freedom Struggle, which was published by Duke University Press in May 2002. Subversive Habits was named a top 5 book published in religion by Publishers Weekly in 2002. It also received the 2002 Letitia Woods Brown Award for Best Book in African American Women's History from the Association of Black Women Historians. Dr. Williams' research has been supported by a host of fellowships, grants, and awards, including a Scholar in Residence Fellowship at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in New York City, a Charlotte W. Newcomb Doctoral Fellowship in Religion and Ethics from the Woodrow Wilson National Foundation, an Albert J. Beveridge Grant, American Historical Association, and the John Tracy Ellis Dissertation Award from the American Catholic Historical Association. Her work has been published in the Journal of African American History, American Catholic Studies, The Washington Post, America Magazine, and the National Catholic Reporter. A distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians, Dr. Williams also authored the award-winning column, The Griot's Cross, published by Catholic News Service. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Shannen Dee Williams.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you all for being here this evening. It is really wonderful to be in community with you here in Chicago. Chicago plays such an outsized role in the history of U.S. Black Catholicism and Black Catholic sisters, so it really is a joy to be with you. Before I begin my formal remarks, I would like to take this opportunity to thank all of the sponsors of tonight's events, every person who offered some labor to organize everything. I understand how much time and effort goes into this, so thank you so much for a warm visit to the University of Chicago Divinity School. What I want to do today and this evening in telling the story of America's Real Sister Act is first give you a sense of how I came to study Black Catholic sisters in the United States, and also begin to give you an overview of this history, making sure that I highlight some sisters from Chicago just to honor this particular moment. So just to tell you a bit about how Subversive Habits began. I was actually in graduate school at Rutgers University, enrolled in a seminar in African American history taught by Deborah Gray White, who was a pioneer of Black women's history. And I set out to go to our library in search of a little known dimension of the American past, hoping to impress her. I had taken to scanning microfilm editions of Black-owned newspapers and finally came across a roll in the Pittsburgh Courier that announced the 1968 formation of a Black Power Federation of Catholic Nuns called the National Black Sisters Conference. The article's title alone, Black Sisters Weigh Contradictions in Christian and Secular Community, immediately piqued my interest. However, it was the accompanying photograph of 4 smiling Black Catholic sisters that steadied my hand on the microfilm reader that day. Up until that moment, I, a lifelong Catholic, had never seen a Black Catholic nun, except in a Hollywood film. In fact, the only Black sister that I knew at the time was Sister Mary Clarence, the fictional character played by Whoopi Goldberg in the critically acclaimed Sister Act film franchise. Deeply ashamed of my ignorance, I soon learned that I was not alone. Even my mother, who had attended Catholic schools for the entirety of her formal education, and who in 1974 became one of the first 3 Black women to graduate from the University of Notre Dame in Indiana, was unaware of the existence of Black nuns in our church. No, only white nuns taught us in our schools, my mother relayed to me on the telephone later that evening. But I wish I had known. I wish we'd had Black nuns in Savannah when I was growing up. Stunned by my mother's revelation, I set out to learn as much as I could about the National Black Sisters Conference and to understand the roots of the invisibility of Black Catholic sisters in our lives. From Father Cyprian Davis's landmark study of the U.S. Black Catholic community, I discovered among many things that there had been Black nuns in my mother's hometown of Savannah, Georgia in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Before anti-Black prejudice and violent threats pushed these consecrated women out, members of 2 separate all-Black sisterhoods had helped to lay the foundation for and ensure the survival of the city's Black Catholic educational system. Their heroic efforts made my mother's, and by extension my own journey into Catholicism possible. Yet, the white sisters and priests who taught my mother and hundreds of other Black children in Savannah during America's civil rights and Black power years never once alluded to Black sisters in their lessons. According to my mother, her white instructors did not teach any Black history or art either. And after calling and writing a host of Catholic institutions to track down some of the sisters and ex-sisters who established the National Black Sisters Conference, I finally began to understand why. The saga of America's Black women who've dared to be poor, chaste, and obedient is largely untold, wrote Sister Mary Copeland in 1975. It is an uneasy story, not only because it is rooted in the American dilemma, racism, but also because the position of a woman in an oppressed group is traditionally delicate and strategic. Now, by the time that I interviewed her, Dr. Copeland was a distinguished professor at Boston College and the first Black president of the Catholic Theological Society of America. She had also been out of religious life for 13 years. In the 1960s and 1970s, however, Dr. Copeland, the first African-American Felician sister in Detroit, Michigan, and later an Adrian Dominican sister, had been one of the conference's most visible leaders. She had also done more than anyone to preserve the organization's memory in the face of marginalization and erasure. In addition to publishing the first scholarly article on the National Black Sisters Conference, Dr. Copeland in the early 2000s arranged for the deposit of the organization's papers at Marquette University. "I'm so glad you're interested in the Black Sisters Conference," she expressed to me during our first conversation. "We've been waiting on someone to tell this story." While Dr. Copeland's willingness to share her experiences with me proved pivotal, it was Dr. Patricia Gray, the conference's founding president, and one of the 4 nuns featured in that Pittsburgh Courier photograph, who radically changed this book's focus. Routinely described by her female and male peers as one of the most intellectually talented and charismatic Catholic sisters of her generation, Gray, who was known in religious life as Sister M. Martin de Porres, had been the conference's heart and soul in its formative years. As Pittsburgh's first Black religious sister of mercy and the conference's leading public voice, she was also the face and force of what some were calling the new Black nun. In 1974, however, Dr. Gray abruptly departed religious life and stopped giving interviews related to the conference. "I don't like to look back," she frequently repeated during the first of our many conversations over the years. However, after I presented Dr. Gray with a recently published book on Catholic sisters' activism and the Black freedom struggle of the 1960s and 1970s, she quickly changed her mind. Visibly frustrated by the book's erasure of Black sisters' vanguard activism in the Catholic fight for racial justice, its cursory mention of white sisters' longstanding practices of white supremacy and exclusion, along with its glaring omissions about the one Black nun briefly discussed in its pages, the 65-year-old ex-sister quietly stood and departed the room. Several minutes later, she returned with a treasure trove, her personal archive from her time in religious life. In handing over the materials, Dr. Gray revealed that in the 1970s, the conference's executive board had desired to publish a book documenting Black sisters' history in the United States. She also lamented to me the enduring invisibility of Black sisters' lives and labors in church and wider American history. Then, in her very great wisdom, Dr. Gray gently encouraged me to consider expanding my attention to the mostly unsung and under-researched history of the nation's Black sisterhoods. We, the NBSC, we're not the first Black sisters to revolt in the church, she quietly declared. If you can, try to tell all of our stories. So in my book, Subversive Habits, I recover the voices of a group of Black American church women whose lives, labors, and struggles have been systematically ignored, routinely dismissed as insignificant, and too often reduced to myth. For 13 years, I sought the untold stories of the nation's Black Catholic sisters, and I must admit, I found no accounts bearing any resemblance to the fabled Hollywood tale of Sister Mary Clarence. I also failed to encounter Black sisters whose lived experiences confirmed many of the existing narratives of American Catholicism or the master story of Catholic sisters in the United States. Instead, from a host of widely ignored archival sources, previously sealed church records, out-of-print books, periodicals, and over 100 oral history interviews, I bore witness to a profoundly unfamiliar history. One that disrupts and revises much of what has been said and written about the U.S. Catholic Church and the place of Black people within it. Because it is impossible to narrate Black sisters' stories and their journey in the United States accurately and honestly without confronting the Church's largely unacknowledged and unreconciled histories of colonialism, slavery, and segregation, I address these violent systems of power and their perpetrators, male and female, directly. And in doing so, my book recovers an overlooked chapter in the history of the long African-American freedom struggle, a tradition of sustained Black Catholic resistance to white supremacy and exclusion that most scholars argue does not exist. When confronted with the silenced past, the greatest responsibility of the historian and the most radical thing any person can do is to tell the story that was never meant to be told. So Subversive Habits marks a new starting point in historical truth-telling in the Catholic Church and wider American society. I argue that for far too long, scholars of the American, Catholic, and Black past have unconsciously and consciously declared, by virtue of misrepresentation, marginalization, and outright erasure, that the history of Black Catholic sisters does not matter. In offering the first full survey of Black sisters' lives and struggles in the United States, my book unequivocally demonstrates that their history does matter and has always mattered. In the 19th century, the United States became home to the modern world's first Roman Catholic sisterhoods freely open to women and girls of African descent. The oldest of the orders, the Oblate Sisters of Providence, were founded in 1828 in Baltimore, Maryland. There have been 8 historically Black orders that we can identify in the United States. All were founded in the South, and all were or were slated to be teaching communities. Their roots are in the cradles of American Catholicism in Florida, in Maryland, Louisiana, Kentucky, and Missouri. Indeed, their story reminds us that the African foundations of American Catholicism are just as old as the European foundations of American Catholicism. Their stories remind us that there have always been 2 transatlantic stories of American Catholicism, one that begins in Europe and another one that begins in Africa as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. The story of the United States and the Black female religious life in the United States is also significant when we compare between the Americas. Take, for example, Brazil, which received the largest numbers of enslaved Africans transported into the Americas as a result of the transatlantic trade. The first community freely open to women and girls of African descent called to consecrated life in the Roman Catholic Church was not established until 1928, almost a century after the Oblate Sisters of Providence were established in Baltimore. And that indeed is the story of the Black sisterhoods in the United States. They are always multilingual and multi-ethnic communities because they are not only preserving the vocations of Black women and girls who are denied admission into the nation's European and white American sisterhoods, but also those that will not accept Black women in Canada, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Of the 8 orders, 3 are still with us, again with the Oblate Sisters of Providence being the oldest and the first successful. Although it is also important to remember that the first women known to profess religious vows in the Roman Catholic Church who are of African descent were not the first to seek admission into those communities. We have documentation of admissions requests that are denied in Louisiana and also in Missouri long before the Oblate Sisters of Providence are able to win approval to establish themselves in the Diocese of Baltimore, which is the nation's first diocese. Their chief foundress, Mother Mary Clarence, is one of 6 African Americans currently on the road to canonization within the church. She is born in Cuba to Haitian parents, and like so much of the revitalization of the Black Catholic community in the 19th century, this community is born of the Haitian Revolution, with large numbers of free and enslaved Black Catholics fleeing into the United States, not only from what was then known as Saint-Domingue, but also other neighboring Caribbean islands. They flood into the nation's port cities, including New Orleans, Baton Rouge, Savannah, Charleston, Baltimore, New York, Philadelphia, etc. We know a bit more about the history of this particular community, but also their own experiences of rejection. Indeed, when they win the support of a French priest who also arrives as a result of the Haitian Revolution, he himself is assigned by his order to begin to minister in the largely neglected, free, and enslaved Black Catholic community in Baltimore, and decides to found a school. And soon thereafter learns that a group of free women of color are already establishing a school, and these women are affiliated with the Catholic Church, being that they are devout women and members of the city's local confraternities. In his first meeting with them, Father James Jobert recounted, quote, that for more than 10 years they had wished to consecrate themselves to God for this good work, waiting patiently that in his own infinite goodness he would show them a way of giving themselves to him. Now in his diary, he doesn't tell us what communities reject the founding members of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, but there are only 3 communities that precede them in the Diocese of Baltimore. They are the Carmelites in Baltimore, the Visitation Sisters in Washington, D.C., and St. Elizabeth Seton's Daughters of Charity in nearby Emmitsburg, Maryland. Those communities will not accept Black women well into the 20th century. They are also all slaveholding communities. Father James Jobert also documents the great opposition that the founding members of the Oblate Sisters experienced, not only from the larger Catholic community, but also from within the clerical community. He wrote, quote, I knew already that many persons who had approved of the idea of a school for pupils disapproved very strongly that of forming a religious house, and could not think of the idea of seeing these poor girls, colored girls, wearing the religious habit and constituting a religious community. Indeed, he tells us from his records that many members of the clerical community in the Diocese of Baltimore characterize his venture as, quote, a profanation of the habit. Despite that opposition, the community will grow and thrive. It's also important to note that the Oblate Sisters of Providence are anomalies in that they are not a slaveholding community. They could have been a slaveholding community, but they also go further than that. Not only do they not accept women, enslaved people as a part of their members' dowry, they do not rely on the labor of enslaved people in their daily lives, they do not own enslaved people, they do not trade in human flesh, but they are also the first U.S. Catholic sisterhood to reject the racist and sexist notion that stated that a woman born into slavery lacked the virtue necessary to enter religious life. Before the U.S. Civil War, they accept at least 8 women into their ranks who were born into slavery and who were able to gain freedom. In one case, one woman was still enslaved when she is admitted into the novitiate, and she is able to secure her freedom before she is allowed to profess vows. This story provides the essential counterpoint, specifically that of Mother Mary Clarence and the early Oblate Sisters of Providence, provide the essential counterpoint to those who dare to excuse or dismiss the slaveholding and segregationism of their peers by stating that those sisters and other men were people of their times. It is important to remind people that Mother Clarence and the early Oblate Sisters of Providence are also women of those times. Indeed, one of their members who was born into slavery, Ellen Joseph West, we know actually a lot about her, not only beyond a photograph, but at the turn of the 20th century, she is believed to be the oldest Catholic sister in the United States. And so there's a lot of attention to her. She's covered in the Washington Post, et cetera. And in the case of all of their members who had entered religious life, who were born into slavery, they all bring with them their freedom papers, their manumission records that are still contained in the archives of the Oblate Sisters of Providence in Baltimore. The community also found St. Francis Academy, which remains open. It is the nation's oldest continuously serving Black Catholic school. The nation's second oldest continuously serving Black Catholic school is St. Mary's Academy in New Orleans, Louisiana, founded by the Sisters of the Holy Family. Their chief foundress is another African-American Catholic on the road to sainthood, Venerable Henriette DeLille. Like their counterparts in Baltimore, the Sisters of the Holy Family form as a result of the anti-Black admissions policies of the European and white American sisterhoods ministering in the state of Louisiana. What is significant about the Sisters of the Holy Family is that they are actually the first community of sisters to be established in the state of Louisiana. They're not the first to minister there. There are other sisterhoods that are ministering there long before they do, but all of those sisters come in from European foundations. They are the first to be established in the state of Louisiana. Also significant, this particular order is also rooted in a rejection of a system of concubinage that was popular and very much a part of life under French rule called plissage, where European men would take free and enslaved women of color as basically their common law wives. Oftentimes these men were able to pass on property to their offspring and sort of allow for them to gain wealth in those society. And what we know from the surviving historical record is that the foundresses of the Sisters of the Holy Family understood this system as a form of sexual terrorism and exploitation. They themselves were all products of the system of plissage. According to their first historian, she wrote, quote, "All of the first sisters were of the very first families of the city, and only one, Sister Suzanne Navarre, was a stranger from Boston. As for the rest, they were all natives of this state, but their fathers were all foreigners, some French, Spanish, or German. They were all descended from the first settlers of Louisiana." Even in the case of Henriette DeLille, we know that she is the great-great-granddaughter of Claude de Bruyere, who is the inaugural French royal engineer, who is one of Louisiana's largest enslavers, whose crews of free and enslaved Black men laid many of the earliest roads, built the first levees, and also constructed the old Ursuline convent in New Orleans, which ironically Henriette DeLille would never be able to enter as a candidate for religious life because of her African heritage and her unwillingness to pass for white, unlike many of her family members. Unlike their counterparts in Baltimore, the Sisters of the Holy Family were also denied the right to wear habits, consecrated clothing signifying their consecrated status for the first 40 or 50 years of their existence. There is some debate in the archival material about what year they won the right to wear habits, and particularly the veil. Their historian noted, quote, "We had a very hard time, for we had many enemies who wanted to degrade our dear little community, as poor as we were. We were persecuted by the Sisters of St. Joseph in this city. They tried all they could to make us take off our habits. That was after 45 or 50 years that we had worked and suffered to have a religious habit. No one would think we were anything if we were not dressed in the holy habit." In this particular episode, in a second history of the community, they explain specifically what happened. The Sisters of St. Joseph, who arrived from France after the Civil War, are there when the Sisters of the Holy Family win the right to wear habits. But they complain and wage a campaign against the Black Order, specifically noting that their habits were too similar to that of their lay sisters, that of their lowest ranked sisters. And so they complained and complained because they wanted the Sisters of the Holy Family recognized as sisters of being the lowest rank and the most inferior rank in the archdiocese, prompting the Sisters of the Holy Family to have to change their habit to satisfy the complaints of the Sisters of St. Joseph. Despite the opposition, they will survive and thrive. One other important distinction that I do want to make about the Sisters of the Holy Family is that unlike the Oblate Sisters of Providence, we know that the community is a slaveholding community for a period of time. At least 2 members own between them 2 or 3 enslaved people. Now, they do not trade in human flesh, but we do know that they rely upon enslaved labor during the earliest years of their community. Because they are historically a Creole community, they also have a discriminatory admissions policy. Before the Civil War, they will only accept women born of elite families. They will not accept dark-skinned women, and we also know that they exclude a Native American woman who sought entry into the community. After the Civil War, a woman who was born into slavery, who was then working as a cook for the Archbishop of New Orleans, sought entry into the community, and they are forced to take a vote, and it splits the community. The Archbishop of New Orleans only recognizes the sisters who vote to include the formerly enslaved women, who will be led by their third foundress, Mother Josephine Charles, who is the foundress who does not own enslaved people and who, according to their records, tell us that above all things love justice. She will also be the superior who helps to redeem the history of the Sisters of the Holy Family as it relates to slavery. After she becomes the superior of the community, she begins to buy up property that was left to her by her German father. And she buys property that was specifically associated with the sins of slavery. One of the first properties that she buys is a former slave trader's pen, which she turns into their school. She also buys the former Quadroon Ballroom that was located at 717 Orland Street, where women of their color and caste were forced to sort of engage and make these connections made through plissage. She buys the property that is described by their historian, their first historian, as a den of sin, and turns it into their mother house and their St. Mary's Academy. So there's a very intentional part on her, there's clear intention behind her to expiate the sins of slavery and also the sexual abuse of Black women and girls under those systems by buying up those properties, and also by formally admitting their first formerly enslaved member, and also ending the community's discriminatory admissions policy. Indeed, in this particular image, this image is contained in the Library of Congress. It features their first non-Creole superior, Mother Mary Austin Jones, who is seated in the center, if you can see her, maybe not, but she is seated from your point, the fourth from the left, who is the superior who really sort of expands their ministries quite considerably, but would not have been allowed to enter prior to the Civil War because of her color and likely because of her parents who were likely born into slavery. Sitting right next to her is the sixth member of the community, Harriet Fazende, who is a descendant of the Spanish Catholic family, the Pintados, who surveyed much of early Spanish Florida and Louisiana, again underscoring both the European and African roots of many of these African American sisters. The third African American sisterhood that is still with us are the Franciscan Handmaids of Mary. They were founded in Savannah, Georgia in 1916, but relocated to Harlem in New York in 1923. This community is the first Catholic sisterhood to be organized in direct protest against the Jim Crow law. In 1950, a Georgia state legislator introduced a bill that would have barred white teachers from teaching African American children and African American teachers from teaching white children. And had it passed, it would have effectively barred African American children from the Catholic educational system in Savannah, Georgia. In response, a white priest named Father Ignatius Listener, who was ministering in the African American community in the Diocese of Savannah, sent word out to the Oblate Sisters of Providence and the Sisters of the Holy Family in hopes that they would be able to send sisters into Savannah and ensure African American access to Catholic education. When those communities had no sisters to send, he went across the country in search of a pious laywoman in hopes of founding a community of African American sisters to preserve African American access to the Catholic educational system. While he's in Washington, D.C. and visiting with the Marist priest at Catholic University of America, he learns of the existence of Eliza Barber Williams, who had been a member of a failed community of Black sisters in Convent, Louisiana, and had spent some time as a novice with the Oblates. By this time, though, she was working as a domestic, answering the doors and phones for the Sisters of Notre Dame de Namur at their Trinity College, which is now Trinity Washington University. According to his records, Father Ignatius Listener explains to Eliza Barber Williams what is happening in Savannah. He describes her as standing up from leaving the sitting room, coming back with her life savings, and telling him that she would be there as soon as possible. And within 6 months, she is there, and within a year, she has recruited several women to come into the community. We also know that one of the earliest members arrived from Cuba, who had been raised by the Carmelites, but who was not allowed to enter the Carmelites in Cuba because of their blood purity laws blocking women of African descent from entering religious life there. By the 1920s, though, they began to run into severe resistance within Savannah, eventually leaving first to settle in New Jersey to serve as domestics for the Society of African Missions before they receive an invitation to start a Black Catholic nursery in New York City, and then begin to expand, founding elementary schools in the Archdiocese of New York. The last community that I just want to mention briefly are the Magdalenes, who were oftentimes known as the Colored Magdalenes. As I mentioned, all but one of the 8 African American sisterhoods were or were slated to be teaching communities. The exception was the Magdalenes. For Black women who felt called to a contemplative vocation, meaning that their primary vocation would be prayer and have very little access and contact with the outside world, there are very few options that they could pursue prior to 1922 unless they were racially ambiguous or could pass for white or simply non-Black. In 1922, to be able to help those who are seeking contemplative vocations to enter religious life, there is, organized by the Good Shepherd Sisters in Baltimore, an all-Black auxiliary to their Good Shepherd Sisters, so Black women who feel called to these contemplative vocations can enter the community. Now, the Magdalenes, we have very little information about them beyond these 2 photographs. There does not seem to be at this time any archives that contain a lot of material about them. We do know that in the 1960s, they integrate back with the Good Shepherd Sisters, with most of the women who integrated remaining, oftentimes becoming superiors. I say 2022 because the last Magdalene recently passed away. Her name was Sister Nellie Hawkins. She entered before the integration back into Baltimore. And during my interview with her, she identified most of the women in these photographs. So we were able to recover much of that history, and she died just last year. One core section of my book is looking at the long fight to desegregate the nation's historically white and white Catholic sisterhoods. We certainly have examples from the 19th century in which women of African descent do enter the nation's historically white and white ethnic sisterhoods. In some cases, they even become superiors. In a few cases, in the case of the Sister Servants of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, the IHM sisters, they actually found white communities. The Oblate Sisters of Providence will give rise to 3 communities beyond themselves. One are the IHM sisters. They also give rise, because of the connection with Mother Theodore, Eliza Barbara Williams, with the handmaids. It's why the handmaid habit is so similar to the Oblate habit. It's really the same. When Eliza Barbara Williams goes to Savannah, it's clear she never gave back her Oblate habit, so that's what she took to Savannah. The Oblates also give rise to the IHM sisters, an order of distinguished sister educators who have a network of academies and also universities. Their history is born of the first crisis in the Oblate Sisters of Providence in Baltimore. Father James Jobert dies in 1845, and the Archbishop of Baltimore attempts to suppress the Oblate Sisters of Providence, telling the sisters that they should just go back into the world and be maids. In this moment of crisis, they will find a champion in a Belgian priest who decides and is able to convince the Archbishop to allow him to serve the community. But in the moment of that crisis, 3 members decide to leave, figuring out, one, there was one attempt to try to go into a community in Belgium in the case of Mother Teresa Maxis Duchemin. But eventually they found another Belgian priest who was wanting to establish a community of sisters and a school for Catholic girls in the state of Michigan, which will become the first Catholic sisterhood in the state of Michigan. Mother Teresa Maxis Duchemin and another member, Anne Constance Schaaf, leave Baltimore and go to begin to establish the community. It's initially called the Sisters of Providence, but they will switch their name to the Sister Servants of the Immaculate Heart of Mary fairly quickly. The third oblate who wanted to join them receives word not to come because she's too dark and she will reveal them. And so she is forced to leave religious life. The IHM sisters thrive in Michigan. The bishops in Michigan do know her secret, but they do sort of keep that to themselves for a good portion of time. The community grows fairly quickly, expanding into Western Pennsylvania and eventually into Eastern Pennsylvania. But Mother Teresa Maxis Duchemin also runs afoul of the bishops. She's very headstrong, very independent. And in their own correspondence, we also know that in addition to their uneasiness with that independence and her leadership, they are oftentimes using racially derogatory words to describe her. These are 2 bishops writing to each other in 1859. I tremble when I think of the impression which will be made when our good people discover that their daughters have been sent to be placed under a mulatto superior. I do not think we are yet ripe for such an anomaly. In order to save her community from fracture, Mother Teresa Maxis Duchemin goes into exile in Canada. She's there for several years before she is old and is allowed to return to her community in Pennsylvania, where she dies and is buried. After her death, the community colludes for several decades to erase their African American foundations and instead state that their third founding member was their chief foundress. They also closed access to their archives, with one superior in Monroe, Michigan, noting in 1928, "We are convinced that silence is the verest, wisest, and most agreeable way of committing to oblivion this subject," and that is their African American roots. In the 1990s, the community formally apologized for their actions, adopted an anti-racist platform. One of the first things that they did was they opened their archive so that researchers would have access to document exactly what had been done. Also, every 3 years, the Oblates and the IHMs have a reunion celebration where they come together to celebrate their shared roots. What is very interesting, though, if you were to go to an IHM website or school today, you may not see, and you would likely not see, the image on the left, which is the only photograph that we have of Mother Teresa Max's Duchemin. Instead, you would see the image on the right, which is an etching of her based on the photograph that they have. And when I was collecting the permissions for my book and for my publications, I had contacted the IHM sisters and asked for the image, because the only image that I had ever seen was the image on the right. And the archivist said, "Well, do you want the photograph or do you want the etching?" And I said, "Oh, I'll take both," not realizing what I would see. And as soon as I got both, I realized what it was. The etching shows Mother Teresa Max's Duchemin wearing the habit of the community that she founded. On the right is the IHM habit. Unfortunately, on the left, right, it's her. That's the only photograph that they have of her, but she's not wearing the habit of the community that she founded. She's wearing the habit of the Great Nuns of Ottawa, which is the community that she was in exile with in Canada for almost two decades. The photo on the left documents the exile, and then it sort of requires then an explanation of why she's not wearing the habit of the community that she founded. And so there are still challenges around sort of being completely honest about the story. And they are not the only community still struggling with these realities. The Sisters of Charity of New York, which was at one point the largest community of sisters in New York City, also had an early Black superior in the 19th century. She is described in their only written history, published history, as the most hidden of the Mothers General. Margaret Whiteman was born in Charleston, South Carolina, either to a free or an enslaved Black mother and a British planter father. Sometime before the Civil War, she leaves, enters the Sisters of Charity, eventually serving as a treasurer, assistant superior of novices, and the directress of novices, and eventually leading the community from 1891 to 1894 until her death. According to the oral history of the community, after her death, one of her successors went into the archive and attempted to destroy everything related to her except her prayer book and a rosary. In 2016, I was invited by the Leadership Conference of Women Religious to deliver an address on my research at their annual meeting. And at the time, I had been struggling with getting access to particular communities' records, especially congregational minutes and the files of sisters who may not have persevered in religious life. And I told this particular story at the meeting, and afterwards, members of the Leadership Council met with me, and they invited me to their mother house in New York City and sat me in a room and confirmed what I had said during the meeting. They said, "Well, all of us in this room have heard this story. However, that's not the entire story. That some things had been preserved, that person who tried to destroy everything had not been successful, and among many things that had survived was a photograph of her." For Black women who went into religious life who were not racially ambiguous, most of those that will go into religious life in the 19th century into white communities are women who are racially ambiguous. And I say racially ambiguous because one didn't necessarily need to be able to pass for white, because many European and white American communities would take Native American women, they would take Latina women, and they would take women of Asian descent. That doesn't mean that those sisters of color are welcomed on an equal basis or have equal status in those communities. Many of them are relegated to domestic labor. But Blackness is the bar. So if a woman of African descent could pass for something else, not white, but maybe something else, some communities would make exceptions. Oftentimes, if this young woman also agreed to cut ties with her visibly Black family members. Most African descended women refuse to do so, but some do make that sacrifice. For those who enter white communities who were born in the United States, but who enter white communities in the 19th century, they are all forced to leave the United States to enter European communities. This is Frederica Law of Savannah, Georgia, some sources say Augusta, Georgia, who enters into the novitiate of the missionary Franciscan Sisters of the Immaculate Conception in Rome in 1880. She becomes ill and will die in Rome in 1883. She is allowed to profess her vows on her deathbed as Sister Benedict of the Angels. She is allowed to enter the community, but she's only allowed to become a lay sister, a lower rank sister in the community. Such is also the case for Frances Johnson of Baltimore, Maryland, who enters into the novitiate of the Franciscan Sisters of Mill Hill in London in 1885. She goes to London with the understanding that she will be accepted on an equal basis, but the community decides that she can only be trained as a tertiary. She professes her vows as Sister Xavier and returns to the United States in 1887 to labor in Baltimore, which she does until her death in 1894. Although her community administers exclusively in the African American community, they will not accept another African American woman until the 1960s. The rest of those who express admission, desire to enter those communities are always directed to the Oblate Sisters of Providence in Baltimore. This is Mother Matilda Beasley, who enters into a Port Clare community, we believe, in York, England, in or a short time before 1885. She comes back and establishes Georgia's first community of Black sisters in 1889 called the Sisters of the Third Order of St. Francis. Her community thrives for some time. She is born into slavery. She is both of African American and Indigenous American descent. And when her community begins to falter after establishing a boarding school and orphanage for Black girls in Savannah, she is advised by the Bishop of Savannah to attempt to integrate her community with a newly founded community in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, established by a woman who would later become Saint Catherine Drexel. She and one of her assistants travels to Philadelphia to meet with Catherine Drexel to explain their situation in hopes of integrating into the community. And this is when the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament, who minister exclusively in the African American and Native American communities, vote collectively to exclude both African American and Native Americans into their ranks. From thenceforward, they say that they would direct Native American applicants into other white communities that would accept Native American vocations and direct the African American candidates to the African American sisterhoods. What's very striking is that in the annals, they say that the sisters themselves will not live on equal terms with Black women. Also significant in the annals, just the entry before, the community had just accepted a Native American woman. Her name was Georgiana Burton, and she was from the Seneca Native American group. She was only accepted as a house sister, meaning that she was relegated to domestic service. But when Mother Matilda Beasley comes with her assistant, that is when the community says that they will not take Native American or African American women. And it's really interesting because they describe her as a very saintly colored woman, and yet they will not even provide novitiate training. Other examples of Black women who go into religious life, into white communities before World War II, the Sisters of the Holy Family of Nazareth, their first U.S. provincial, adopts at least 6 mixed-race girls, 3 of whom became members of the community in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries. The first of these young women to enter the community was Sister Mary Ann Charleston, born Stella Charleston, who entered in 1889. She will be sent outside of the United States to serve in Paris and later in Rome. She also serves in Poland. The other 2 members that we have documentation for serve both in Chicago and also in Brooklyn and Philadelphia. But again, the story specifically of racially ambiguous Black women who enter religious life prior to World War II overwhelmingly is a story of women who are going into the Black orders. Women who refuse, when given the option of entering a white community, that they must cut off ties with their visibly Black family members, steadfastly refuse to do so. The membership and group photographs of the African American sisterhoods are filled with women like this. Among them is Rebecca Clifford, who was the valedictorian of the Sisters of the Blessed Sacraments, St. Francis de Sales Academy in Rockcastle, Virginia. In 1905, she rejects an offer to enter a white sisterhood in Philadelphia on the condition that she pass for white and cut ties with her visibly Black mother. In this particular case, she has an older brother who wants to leave Virginia and who wants to pass as a white man. He's willing to leave his mother behind, but he will not leave his sister, and so he finds a priest who finds a white order that's willing to accept her, but only under those conditions. She steadfastly refuses and instead joins the Oblate Sisters of Providence in Baltimore, and eventually becomes their superior from 1926 until her death in 1937, and she will truly be the superior that helps the community begin to desegregate the nation's Catholic colleges and universities. What's significant about her story is that we actually understand and have, at least from the historical record, what she said when she was given that offer. And she tells this to her former teacher, who was a Sister of the Blessed Sacrament, because they had also rejected her that year as well because they did not take African American women. She told her teacher, quote, "That I should not have my mother visit me, I think positively wrong and not the will of God. My mother is making a great sacrifice in giving up her only daughter to God. She is doing it most willingly. Should I impose an unnecessary sacrifice upon her? My decision in this is that the white people have many to work for them, but the colored people have very few. They are my own people, and I think God wants me to give them the first place, and I don't think I would be blessed if I were to do otherwise." Such was also the case for an early Maryknoll sister, in fact, the 14th Maryknoll sister, and the congregation's first treasurer. Elsie St. Clair Davis became Sister M. Frances Davis. She enters the community when they were known as the Teresian Sisters in 1914. She enters from the Diocese of Brooklyn. Her biological parents had passed away. Her father dies first, and then her mother remarries, has another child, and then her mother dies, and so she decides to enter religious life. What's very interesting in the annals from the Teresian records, she tells the sisters up front who she is. She says that she will not be cut off from her stepfather and her younger sister, who are described in the annals as Black. And the sisters express admiration for her, her dignity in this decision, and they allow her to enter the community, and she remains until her death. She's actually in the second group of Maryknoll sisters who are sent to China to undertake missionary work. What's very interesting, though, up until recently, if you had gone to their online database of deceased sisters or any of their records about their African American sisters, Sister Frances was never included. Most people would say that the first African American Maryknoll was Sister Geneva Lassiter, who entered in 1956, but indeed it was Elsie St. Clair Davis, and since then the community has recognized her. There are some communities, though, that would never take a Black woman, whether or not she could pass for white or not. Indeed, if you were caught passing for white, you could be removed from a community. Such was the case for Mildred Dolbear, who was a native of Mobile, Alabama. She was Creole, but she comes from a very elite family. Her father owns a cigar factory. He's very wealthy, and so that offers protection for the family. They are educated in white schools. However, after her father dies, the family loses its protection, and they begin to migrate out of Mobile, some going into the West. In the case of Mildred, she attempts to become a religious sister of mercy in St. Louis. She enters the community in 1929, but someone in Mobile writes to the Religious Sisters of Mercy, to their superior, and tells them that you have a Creole in the community and that she must come out. And the superior contacts the superior in St. Louis, and she says she must come out. You may not know it, but she has a grandmother who is Black and pure Negro and Black in color, and she must come out of the community, and she is removed in 1930. However, I was able to track her in the U.S. Census, and I found her in a community of visitation sisters in Richmond, Virginia, which she entered in 1930 and remains until her death in 1963. It's funny, when I contacted the visitation sisters, they of course did not know about her African heritage, and I didn't want to out her, but I did want a photograph if they had one. But I had to sort of explain that she may have been a woman of color, and in response, I didn't hear anything more from the community, but I in fact heard back from her niece, who was still alive. And she was also unaware of their family's history. And initially in our first conversation, she just said, you know, I just want to assure you, I know who my family is. And I said, well, if you have the time and if you know your family's history, because you can track it in the census, oftentimes when people begin to pass for white, you see them in one town identified as colored or with the M for what was the term mulatto. And then when they move to another town, you can begin to see the passing. And I was also able to sort of trace in the census to identify that African-American, that Black grandmother. And she and her siblings were very happy to know, and they gave me the photograph. In other instances, though, communities again would not take Black women who were racially ambiguous. This is Innocent Chenoweth, who became Sister Mary Alice Chenoweth, an Oblate Sister of Providence. In 1934, she was denied admission into the Sisters of Charity of the Blessed Virgin Mary, her educators in Rock Island, Illinois, and the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament. When she was rejected by the BVM sisters, her educators, they told her, well, maybe you should apply to Mother Catherine Drexel and her community. Surely they would take African Americans since they minister in the African American community. She receives a rejection letter from Mother Catherine Drexel, who informs her of the existence of the Black orders, and she chooses the Oblate Sisters of Providence, which she enters in 1936 and remains until her death just a few years ago. What's significant about Innocence Chenoweth, Sister Mary Alice, her mother was German American and her father was African American. After her father's death, her mother, Victoria Chenoweth, becomes a lay assistant to the BVM sisters at their Black schools. And she herself begins to preserve vocations that are being denied by the BVMs, because she knows that not only do they not accept Black girls, they generally do not tell them about the existence of the Black orders. And so when I began doing interviews of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, I interviewed Sister Charlotte Marshall, and she said, you know, her mother saved my vocation and several other vocations because I was rejected from the community. I was educated by them in Memphis, Tennessee. I was heartbroken. And then their lay assistant pulled me aside one day and said, I know of a community that you can enter. And this is what her mother did. And going behind the sisters and making sure that she could preserve as many vocations as possible. And indeed, that is the story of the African American sisterhoods. Many of these women are traveling hundreds and even thousands of miles away from their hometowns to be able to enter communities willing to accept their vocations. And like their white counterparts, African American Catholic families send many of their children into religious life. These are the famous Burke sisters of Louisville, Kentucky. Their parents can trace their lineage to the formerly enslaved of the Catholic Holy Land in Kentucky. Their parents, Emma and Charles Burke, send 5 of their daughters into the Oblate Sisters of Providence, 4 of which remain until their death. One sister becomes ill, but the rest remain, with the last Burke sister dying just a few years ago. These are the Price siblings of Baltimore, Maryland, coming out of St. Peter Claver in Baltimore. They had 5 children to enter religious life, 4 who became Oblate Sisters of Providence, and 1 son who became a Josephite priest, which is an order of priests that minister exclusively in the African American community. These are the famous Thomas sisters of Akron, Ohio, by way of Lebanon, Kentucky. They will send 4 of their daughters into religious life. 3 of the oldest go into the Franciscan Handmaids of Mary in New York City, and the youngest sister, Josephine, desegregates the Sisters of St. Joseph of St. Mark in Cleveland, Ohio, with the last Thomas sister who went into religious life dying just a few years ago. This family can trace their lineage to a Black laywoman named Mary Eliza Spalding Smith, who was enslaved by the Spalding family that will give rise to 2 of the nation's earliest bishops, and John Lancaster Spalding and Martin Spalding, as well as connected to Sister Catherine Spalding, who was the foundress of the Sisters of Charity of Nazareth. The Spaldings own a significant number of enslaved people in the Holy Land. In the case of Mary Eliza Spalding Smith, her husband Pius Smith was one of the enslaved people who helped to build the Trappist Monastery in the Holy Land. Her son becomes one of the first 4 African-American SVD priests and later becomes the first African-American Trappist monk. But this family and their extended family will send several young people into religious life, becoming pioneering Black sisters and priests, and also members of the nation's historically Black sisterhood. Specifically, a lot of them go into the Holy Family Sisters. What's funny in her obituary is that Mary Eliza Spalding Smith is described as sort of an evangelical leader, sort of evangelizer in the community, and that noting that she was well respected by both the by the Black community and also the white community. She's buried in St. Augustine Cemetery in Lebanon. And when I went to go find this particular marker, I realized I knew of the existence of segregated cemeteries, but it was the first segregated cemetery that I ever entered. And I wondered, how was I going to be able to find this? You know, once you get to a place, you're like, oh, I'm so ambitious, I'm gonna go find this marker. And I was like, maybe I won't be able to find it. But when you drive into St. Augustine Cemetery, you'll notice where the formerly enslaved of the community and the African and their descendants are buried. It's segregated, and on the right side, most of those who were enslaved by the church are buried in unmarked graves. They're not marked. And so this marker is one of the few headstones that is in that side of the cemetery, which made finding the headstone fairly easy. It's not until World War II that we begin to see white communities begin to rethink the morality and utility of their anti-Black admissions policies. First, of course, with contemplative communities whose members have very little contact with the outside world. The nation's first interracial monastery is established right outside of Montgomery, Alabama, in 1945, established by 3 former members of an all-white Dominican monastery in Catonsville, Maryland, right outside of Baltimore. In 1944, 2 African-American women seek admission and submit applications to that community and are rejected on the basis of race. In response, 3 members of that community leave in hopes of founding the nation's first racially inclusive monastery, which they're able to do. Their first member to remain is Sister Mary of the Rosary, who was a native of Chicago, who was all set to enter the Oblate Sisters of Providence, had been educated by the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament on the South Side, was directed to the Oblate Sisters of Providence, but always had a contemplative vocation, and so she entered into this community. Apostolic communities, those that have public ministries such as teaching, nursing, and social work, are slower to open their ranks to African American women and girls, in part because these young women oftentimes not only had to desegregate their communities, but also the parishes, the hospitals, and or schools that their orders ministered in. And many of these women have a very difficult time. In the case of the first community to publicly announce the admission of their first African American members, the Sisters of St. Mary of the Third Order of St. Francis in St. Louis, Missouri, who are now the Franciscan Sisters of Mary, take 5 African American women in 1946, 3 in July of that year, 2 more in December. Those pioneering Black sisters are admitted only on a segregated basis. The community builds a separate novitiate for them to live in. They enforce segregation in dining, eating, socializing. Initially, they even barred their African American members from entering into the mother house and then only entering through the back doors. These pioneering Black members are also among a handful of Black sisters who we know were forced to profess their vows in segregated ceremonies. In this particular instance here, they are marching to a segregated altar in a segregated church. And if you'll notice here, but to the right seated are 2 Oblate Sisters of Providence. The Oblate Sisters of Providence, any chance that they found out that a white community was desegregating, admitting their first Black member, they always sent members to bear witness to that moment in an act of solidarity. They always reached out to make sure that these young women were okay, visiting with them, and many of the pioneering Black sisters in white communities that I had talked to who had Oblate Sisters of Providence befriend them during this time, cite those women in their acts of friendship and solidarity with keeping them in religious life for as long as they did. The Oblates had been in St. Louis since the late 19th century and sent many of their former students into historically white communities, but also who helped to desegregate many of the nation's historically white colleges and universities, as well as they were also foot soldiers of that movement. In this particular campaign to begin to desegregate white sisterhoods, we see the role of white priests who minister in the African American community become significantly important. Every application always has to have a letter of recommendation from a spiritual advisor. And so we begin to see white priests oftentimes submitting applications for young women or offering and doing the initial inquiry. And specific inquiry, and part of what they're doing is simply making sure that these young women don't experience the pain of a racist rejection. And so a survey of the General Council minutes of white communities, especially after World War II, bears witness to this reality. This is Chicago and the Religious Sisters of Mercy, who are one of the earliest communities of white sisters to extend their ministries to arriving African American migrants and immigrants into the city during the first and second Great Migrations. Mother Provincial of the province of Chicago, Mother M. Genevieve Crane, reported that she is being faced with the problem of accepting colored girls as postulants. Mother understands that a priest is sending in an application for 2 girls to enter the novitiate. The problem was discussed by the General Council, but no action was taken. Mother asked the members of the General Council to give it serious thought and fervent prayer. Sometimes white priests write their own letters of inquiry. This is one priest from Harlem writing to all of the superiors in New York in 1946, getting to the meat of his question, the meat of his letter in his second paragraph. Is the order Catholic enough to accept colored vocations? I'm in a colored parish and am immediately concerned with this information. And what Father John F. O'Brien will discover over and over again is no, no, no. In the case of the Religious Sisters of Mercy, they even write to the Vatican to sort of deal with this issue. In a letter from 1946, their head of the Mercy Union writes, quote, "Enclosed is a copy of a letter that I received from one of our mothers provincial relative to the acceptance of colored girls to our institute. The problem is forced upon us because of the number of colored students we now teach in our schools. Even though the training of colored subjects would necessarily differ in some respects from the training of other subjects, the colored would no doubt resent a separate novitiate. It seems too at this time that the sisters in general would not welcome colored subjects into our present novitiates. This letter is significant for a host of reasons. One, it confirmed much of the testimony that I had collected already from the nation's Black sisters, those who had desegregated white communities, and those who had entered the Black sisterhoods. What's also key is that it tells us that Black girls, women and girls who felt called to the charisms of white communities, and particularly the Mercies, were considered problems before they ever stepped foot in the convent, that they were never given the chance. It also documents the anti-Black animus of white sisters in communities, noting that most would not welcome them into the community. Also underscoring that anti-Blackness is not seen as disqualifying for white sisters in religious life. Perhaps most notably, when she writes, the problem is forced upon us because of the number of colored students we now teach in our schools. This helps to underscore that just because white sisters teach Black children does not signify a commitment to racial justice or racial equality. Just because you teach them does not mean that you care. And so, for pioneering Black sisters in white communities, many of them will have difficult times, many of whom do not remain, and because they do not remain in religious life, oftentimes their records are closed. Sometimes the only documentation that we have of these young women come from Black Catholic newspapers and other Black newspapers who documented every time that a Black girl desegregated a white community. This is Mary Dolores Allen of St. Louis, Missouri, who enters into the Missionary Servants of the Holy Ghost in Techny, Illinois as the community's first African-American postulant. She doesn't remain. In fact, their only African-American member is Sister Rose Martin Glenn, who was born in Birmingham, Alabama, but raised on the south side of Chicago. She enters in 1958. And when I interviewed her, she told me she was the first African-American member of her community, and I said, "You weren't." And she didn't know. And she said, "I wouldn't have known because they would not have told me." Some women have to wait several years before they enter communities. This is Joyce Williams of Chicago, Illinois, who migrated to the city in 1942, coming from Summit, Mississippi. From 1942 to 1944, she volunteered at the Friendship House in Chicago, converting to Catholicism, feeling called to a Benedictine vocation, applying to the order first in 1944, and was rejected on the basis of race. But the community was so impressed with her application that they gave her a full scholarship to their college in Minnesota. There she continues to apply and be rejected. In 1948, after she graduates, she applies again and is rejected. In fact, with the superior writing, quote, "We do not know what your people would eat," even though she had been a residential student at their college in Minnesota. In 1949, the community elects a new superior who was her former college dean. 1949, she is admitted and she remains until her death. This is Sister Daniel Marie Miles, who was an early school sister of St. Francis who served in Chicago. Like many pioneering Black sisters in white communities, she endures unconscionable bullying. She talks about praying to become white, having to suppress and denigrate her own African heritage in an attempt to feel accepted in her community, noting in a testimony collected in 1969 in Chicago, "During recreation time, I'd walk up to the sisters and they'd turn away when they saw me coming. I used to pray to God to change me and not them, so I'd be acceptable to them, and they wouldn't turn away when they saw me coming. Some of the sisters, when I tried a little group, would tell me, 'No, get out of here.' This was after I did everything I knew how to try to become white. I was ashamed of being Black then, and nobody really let me be as white as I tried." Some sisters are still forced to leave the United States to enter communities, accepting of their vocations. This is Phyllis Ray Johnson of Detroit, Michigan, a graduate of Wayne State University. She applies for admission into all the northern contemplative communities from 1948 to 1950, is rejected. During that time, she learns French and applies to go into a French-speaking Trappistine community in Canada, where she enters in 1950 and remains until her death. This is Sister Cora Marie Billings, who was the first African-American to be accepted into the Religious Sisters of Mercy. She enters in Philadelphia. She is still alive, and she's not the first member of the community to persevere. There's someone who entered after her who has since died, but the first African-American accepted into her community, and also likely the first US-born Black woman to enter a congregation in Philadelphia. Her story is really interesting. She had actually two aunts who became Oblate Sisters of Providence, who were rejected admission into the Religious Sisters of Mercy, who were their educators in Philadelphia in the 1940s. They will remain Oblate Sisters of Providence until their deaths. Their father was John Aloysius Lee Sr., who was the second African-American graduate of Roman Catholic High School in Philadelphia, which is the nation's oldest Catholic high school. He is a distinguished layman who was a star athlete who, after graduating from high school, where he became the first African-American to ever sort of play basketball in a Catholic league, went on to found the earliest Black sort of sports league, swimming, basketball, track, golf, et cetera, in Philadelphia, becoming the first African-American to win the Vercelli Medal from the Philadelphia Archdiocese. His father, William Henry Lee, was one of the enslaved people who worked for the Jesuits at Georgetown. And indeed, this is the story of so many pioneering Black sisters, not only looking at their lineage, linking them to the early American church, but also a story of women who are breaking some of the nation's most difficult racial and gender barriers. This is Sister Dr. Frances Douglass, who was the first African-American daughter of the Heart of Mary, and also the first African-American to earn a PhD in psychology from Fordham University. We have always thought that the first African-American to chair a department at a historically white institution of higher education in the United States was Dr. John Hope Franklin, the great Dr. John Hope Franklin, premier historian of the African-American experience. He does so, or we thought, in September of 1956 when he becomes the head of the history department at Brooklyn College. Interestingly, same month, same year, Dr. Frances Douglass becomes the first African-American to chair a department at DePaul University here in Chicago. She is also the first woman of color to chair a department at Marquette University. So despite sort of that reality, the historical record proves that she should get the credit and share it with Dr. John Hope Franklin. There are other African-American sisters who are pioneer members of their own communities who go on to found the National Black Sisters Conference. This is Dr. Elfrida Chapman, who is a pioneer information studies scholar whose research in sort of helping to sort of examine the information-seeking behaviors of marginalized populations made her a star in the field. There are several scholarships named after her in schools of information science. Most people did not realize that she was the first African-American sister, Humility of Mary sister in Ohio. This is Dr. Marcelina Brooks, who in 1983 became the first woman to serve as president of the historically Black Bowie State University in Maryland. She's a former Oblate Sister of Providence and founding member of the National Black Sisters Conference. This is Sister Thea Bowman, the third African-American sister on the road to sainthood in the Roman Catholic Church, who was also a founding member of the National Black Sisters Conference, who desegregates her community, the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration in La Crosse, Wisconsin, goes on to earn a PhD in English from the Catholic University of America, where she teaches the institution's first course in African-American literature, goes on to become the first African-American professor and African-American chair at her institution's Viterbo University in Wisconsin, but who later becomes and develops a ministry that combines African-American historical truth-telling, teaching, preaching, singing, dancing, drawing upon her ministry of love and seeking to heal and bring about racial justice and healing within the church. It is these stories that I argue constitute the story of America's real Sister Act. And indeed, in writing this book, even as I was researching the book, but also even after the book came out, what to me stands as their greatest legacy is that of their former students who wrote to me over and over again, giving me advice, giving me information, giving me primary sources to ensure that the sisters that had touched their lives so much would be recorded and preserved. Even people after the book came out or knew that the book was coming out was sending me information, sometimes on Twitter where I tweet under the handle Black Non-Historian. People reached out telling me stories of women that I had studied, but also to sort of receive sort of confirmation of what was contained in the archive, with one woman asking if I was covering the Oblate Sisters of Providence, noting that her former teacher, who she described as the most wonderful person in the world, Sister Emily Burke, was a member of the order. And I said, oh my goodness, I included an image of the Burke sisters in my book. other people sending me photographs of their aunts who were members of religious communities. In the case of Dr. Terry Givens telling me about an aunt who was a member of the Sisters of the Holy Family, also noting that she had 2 great aunts who were also nuns as well. In some instances, sisters or former pupils got a copy of my book, looked up to see in the index if one of their former teachers had been included, and were excited and sent me their own archive saying, if you've never seen her signature, I have it if you want to see it. In some instances, former students give a sense of the kinds of roles that Black sisters played in communities, making home visits, the discipline. Also, one individual writing me, sort of thanking the Oblate Sisters of Providence. He wasn't Catholic, but his parents put him in a Catholic school. Also noting that the first person he ever saw do a crossover drivel was Sister Mary Paul Lee. Noting that every student at Immaculate Conception High School in Charleston, South Carolina, for literally a decade, they were all state basketball champions, and they were all coached by Sister Mary Paul Lee. Sister Mary Paul Lee is the aunt of Sister Cora Marie Billings. She is the daughter of John Aloysius Lee, who again was the first African American to play basketball in a Catholic league. This is his photo from 1902 from Roman Catholic High School. He was so known, so respected in the community, not only in the Catholic community, but also because of his work in bringing equality and equity in sports. He actually has a recreation center named after him in West Philadelphia, the Lee Cultural Center, which is still a mainstay in the West Philadelphia community. The last story that I want to tell this evening is the story of Dr. Sharon Tolbert Glover. If you do read my book, you'll notice in chapter 3, I tell the story in Chicago of an incident in 1962 where an African-American sister is assigned to an all-white parish in the Chicago suburbs, and the white Catholic mothers revolt against her, picketing against the Black nun to the point that they drive her out of the parish. When I first began interviewing, I looked for this woman in the story. It was only covered once in the Chicago Defender, nowhere else in the Catholic newspapers that I could find. I had interviewed Sister Jamie Phelps, who is an Adrian Dominican sister, who said, I think that happened to an Afro-Puerto Rican sister, and so I just assumed that it was probably her. After my book came out, I received an email from a white priest in Minnesota who said, I don't know if you got a chance to interview these 2 former members of my parish who have since passed on, but they were former nuns, and he sent me their obituaries, links to their obituaries. And in the obituary for Dr. Sharon Tolbert Glover was the incident. When she was 15 years old, she became a nun at the Convent of the Servites of Marion, Illinois. And when she was assigned to a parish in suburban Chicago, the all-white congregants refused to accept her, causing her to resign from the order. She went on to college, etc. Went on to have a distinguished career in higher education, but eventually left higher education, a position at the University of Minnesota, the last position, to reopen the St. Peter Claver School in St. Paul, Minnesota, which had been founded by the Oblate Sisters of Providence in 1950 and was one of 2 Black Catholic schools in Minnesota until it closed in 1989. Although she had passed away, her sister and her nephew were still alive, and I reached out to them, and they gave me the photo in one of the photos and said that, yes, that was my aunt, that was my sister. For so many people, Whoopi Goldberg's performance as Sister Mary Clarence remains the dominant interpretation of an African-American Roman Catholic nun and the desegregation of a white sisterhood in the United States. What I hope I've done this evening is to tell you and to demonstrate to you that the story of America's Real Sister Act is far more compelling. It is the story of how generations of African-American Catholic women and girls fought against racism, sexism, and exclusion to answer God's call in their lives and to become and minister as consecrated women of God. Theirs is a legacy that perhaps is best articulated in a response given to me by Sister Loretta Teresa Richards, who was the longtime superior of the Franciscan Handmaids of Mary. In 2009, I asked her what she thought the greatest legacy of Black sisters was, and she did not hesitate to respond. She said the Catholic Church wouldn't be Catholic if it wasn't for us. We were the people, we were the ones who taught that racism had no place within the Catholic Church. We were the ones who taught over and over again that the lives, souls, and futures of Black people mattered. That if the church was going to be a church that affirmed the life and dignity of every person, then they absolutely had to affirm the life and dignity of African American people. Thank you for your time.
As we move to Q&A, if you could please wait till we get the microphone so our online audiences can hear you. We'll also be accepting questions from our online audience, so feel free to post those in the chat and they'll be read over the microphone. So any questions to get us started?
You ready? Thank you so much. My question was about the instance where someone wrote to the Vatican to request guidance about what they were going to do with sort of their Negro problem in the American church. And I'm curious if you found any evidence or suggestion that the Vatican ever took a position on segregation in the American church, and whether sort of ethnic segregation in orders was a global problem and something that they either allowed, discouraged in other parts of the world, or whether it was a uniquely American.
Thank you so much for that question. And I'll answer it in two ways. First, the apostolic delegate to the United States did respond to the mercy request, and he affirmed that they should create an all-Negro province, which is something that they had done elsewhere throughout the Atlantic world. This is not a uniquely American problem. What we will see European and white American communities doing in Africa is forming separate, unequal, oftentimes auxiliary communities or separate all-African congregations to be able to circumvent or avoid the integration of their own ranks. It becomes a little bit more complicated because in the United States, there are white communities that were far more willing to accept Black women who were born outside of the United States instead of US-born Black women. In the same way, European communities would take US-born Black women, but would not accept Black women coming from their colonies. And so it's a very complicated, very divisive admissions policy. But absolutely, this is a global issue. I have been sort of reading the works of scholars of women religious in Africa, and what we know, at least one scholar in Belgium has gotten access to Vatican records looking at sort of responses to how African women who are in these separate communities and also sort of their European superiors are responding to pressure not only to admit African descendant or African women into their ranks, but also to admit them on an equal basis. Because in so many cases, many of these women that were a part of these auxiliary communities were oftentimes relegated to domestic service. You know, not only just sort of eating separately, they would sometimes not allow them to wear shoes. I mean, the kinds of abuses that these women in these communities faced are quite gut-wrenching, but it is certainly not an American phenomenon. This is a problem within the history of women's religious life, even though we will have exceptions of women who are communities that will accept African descendant women into their ranks, sometimes women who are kidnapped from slavery, who are coming into communities, who are allowed to stay in communities, but in certain instances, they are only allowed to sort of become domestics. We sort of think of Venerable Teresa Chakaba, who is enslaved in she's enslaved and then she comes into Spain, is working in an elite household, and is then able to sort of get into a Spanish community, but only as a domestic. Also in the case of someone like Saint Josephine Bakhita, who was the first Black woman canonized in the modern era, she is kidnapped and she is enslaved under Islamic auspices and then sort of ends up in a Catholic order and refuses to come out when her enslavers try to pull her out, and she's allowed to remain in that community. So we'll have some of those examples also in Latin America, but there is a systematic policy, and certainly in Latin America and the Caribbean, sort of it's actually built into secular law according to blood purity laws that Black women and girls cannot go into religious life. The exceptions only involve women of elite status or have elite connections. Otherwise, they can only sort of become sort of these religious servants in the communities that take sort of temporary vows and have to be renewed every year. But yes, thank you so much for that question.
Just wanted to say this is not the first time I've heard you on this subject. My name is Ann Jones, and the Rita Casella Jones lecture, which you gave under the auspices of Fordham University over Zoom in 2021, was named after Mom. And you answered some of my question at the end, that because that was before your book was published. And I know that once something like this hits, stuff comes out. And you were reflecting that at the end. Is there anything that, none of those things I think surprised you, that may have pleased you. Was there anything that surprised you?
What surprised me was how willing people now are willing to be forthright in their conversations. When I was doing the research, there was so much fear, not only among myself, like, oh my goodness, I'm about to tell these stories, my goodness, you know, what are the consequences, but also among the sisters and former sisters themselves. Great fear. I mean, there are a lot of stories that I did not tell, and there are some stories that I am going to have to take to my grave. There's one sister who I interviewed in Louisiana who desegregated the New Orleans public schools during the crisis in the early 1960s. And I wanted to tell her story because so many Black sisters desegregate Catholic high schools, but also a lot of public schools, and were foot soldiers in that way. And I said, well, I was like, oh my goodness, I get to put her in the book. And then she said, you know, though, I have a sibling who's passing for white in the year of our Lord, still passing in 2023, at that time, 2021. And she said, you know, if you put my name in it, you reveal my sibling. And I can't do that. So that's one example where, even though some people are willing to talk about it, there may be other factors that still force me to sort of be quiet, or hold on to secrets. Perhaps what most surprised me was sort of an action taken by the Adrian Dominican sisters. And they were one of the communities who, after my 2016 presentation to the Leadership Conference of Women Religious, invited me to their community to deliver a presentation, but also to help them to begin to sort of investigate their own complicity in this sin of segregation and white supremacy. And what I do in every turn when I visit communities is I tell every community, you need to figure out your own story, your own specific story. Every community story is different. You need to pay attention to what's in the archive, but also what's not in the archive, but what should be in the archive. What's missing, but also you need to reconstruct the history of sisters of color in your community, not just Black sisters, but other sisters. And the Adrian Dominican sisters were one of the few communities who did a lot of hard work, and they put together a pamphlet to sort of begin to sort of process and create a program for how the sisters were going to continue to do this work. And then like a month after, I received a letter, an email from Dr. Patricia Gray and the National Black Sisters Conference, and they said, I hope you see this. The Adrian Dominican sisters gave $1 million in the name of reparations for their own sin history of segregation, giving $500,000 to Xavier University and scholarships named after their first US-born Black member, Sister Jamie Phelps, and then another $500,000 to Michigan State for scholarships for students enrolled in African American studies. It's been really interesting to sort of see who has come and who was willing to sort of take the next step. But again, a lot of sort of stories of former pupils, former sisters, the niece of an older woman, who had been denied admission into a community. She said, I need you to talk to my aunt. She has that story. And when I interviewed her aunt, the pain was still there. She said, you know, when I received the rejection, I literally put the letter in a drawer and I put it away for several years. And I showed it to my older sister, and she said, I wish I had showed it to her years before, because she was just like, oh, don't worry about that, that's their loss. But she was so heartbroken because she internalized the rejection as if there was something wrong with her. And so what stands out to me the most is how many lay women have these stories who are finally willing to talk about it now because they have been silenced. I think that's another piece of the story of Black sisters in the United States, and that is the story of the lost vocations. How many vocations did we lose? On the one hand, we can track it if we get complete access to archives, and we can see the rejections in terms of the applications. We're very grateful for the work of Father Raymond Bernard, who was a Jesuit from 1949 to 1959, who did a lot of this hard work in the 1950s, publishing the results of his surveys of the nation's sisterhoods to ascertain what their policies were with regard to the admission of, quote, qualified Negro girls. However, a lot of the sisters that I interviewed and ex-sisters that I interviewed said, you know, I didn't even submit an application. I asked my teacher. I asked the visiting vocation director. So the rejection was oral, so there is no written record of the rejection. So we can't even begin to know how many vocations that we lost. In a place like Chicago, the Religious Sisters of Mercy are getting so many applications that they are trying to sort of form an all-Negro province. That's that many. Because they are not allowed to do so, because the cardinal says don't do so, because the problem of segregation is bitterly contested in Chicago, they don't do so. And they never take one in Chicago. despite the numbers of Black children that they are educating. So again, I think for me most is how many more stories will we get when people read the book? And I hope that it will release in some people whatever shame or pain that they are still hanging on, to sort of remind them that they are a part of a community and a part of a story, and it was never them. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.